Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope you can see me and hear me. Um, I'm Richard Galeo. I'm helping moderate this webinar session with Lucio Forti, who's the webmaster for Division 52. Just wanted to mention, just as an introduction, what this session is about. This is the session on developing international psychology, leaders, publication, and scholarship by Dr. Gielen. This webinar session will focus on publication opportunities for international psychologists and leaders in internationally oriented journals, newsletters, and book series. The opportunities include those provided by APA's International Psychology Division, as well as those sponsored by other institutions and publishers. So without further ado, I would like to hand over the presentation to Dr. Gielen. Dr. Gielen?
And what do I do now?
You can begin speaking.
Good evening, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry, start over.
Yeah. Okay, sorry.
Good evening, friends, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to discuss this evening some international publishing opportunities for psychologists. In academic circles, it is generally understood that gaining a permanent academic position and exerting leadership are, at most universities and many colleges, closely linked to one's publication record. This certainly holds true for the more research-oriented areas of psychology, but it also remains important in the more applied areas. In addition, leadership in major professional organizations is greatly facilitated by a person's publication activities in journals, newsletters, and books. In recent decades, psychology has grown into an increasingly global discipline, and reflecting this trend, APA in 1997 established its new International Psychology Division, or Division 52. In the following, I will focus on 3 publication outlets that this Division 52 has created. And these include a newsletter, the International Psychology Bulletin, a relatively new journal, namely International Perspectives in Psychology, Research, Practice, and Consultation, and a recently established international book series, which is being published by Information Age Publishing. So you should have in front of you 3 pictures, namely the International Psychology Bulletin, which is now in its, has been published for 20 years now. Then the new journal, International Perspectives in Psychology, and finally a new volume that appeared in Division 52's new series in international books. The volume is entitled Pathfinders in International Psychology. Let me start with the International Psychology Bulletin because it's easily the oldest publication outlet in the division. It is published quarterly, and it is also refereed, which is not always the case with newsletters. It has had several publishers and editors. The present editor is Vaishali Raval, and the associate editors are Sveta Dimitrova and Jenna-Mary Quickbaum. Before that, Grant Rich was the editor for a number of years. The bulletin is a bit unusual because it's quite lengthy. Typical issues in the last few years have often been somewhere between about 50 and 80 or even 90 pages in length. And one reason for that is that the bulletin combines the purposes of a newsletter with those of a journal. That's also why it's a refereed newsletter, meaning that the more journal-like articles in the bulletin are sent out to referees. What will you find in this bulletin? Well, there are peer-reviewed research articles, 4 or 5 or so per issue. And it's interesting to note that these articles are written by a truly international cast of authors and or cover many different areas in the world, whether that be Africa, Asia, Australia, Latin America, Europe, North America, and so on. Then, as befits a newsletter, you will find there reports and news related to Division 52, some book reviews. Then, very important for the division, we have a certain emphasis on early career professionals, and so there's a column of special interest to and published by early career professionals. Similarly, there's a student column, and both of these are very important because APA divisions in recent years have sometimes had the problem that the membership has been aging rapidly and the next generations are not properly represented. So Division 52 has made special efforts to not fall into this type of situation. Then, importantly, there is a section having to do with teaching international psychology, which has increased considerably in recent years, in part because psychologists around the world have been multiplying, in part because more and more internationally oriented articles are published both in North America and Europe, but also in other parts of the world. Then there are historical issues of an international nature that are being discussed in articles, and a heritage mentoring project. So these are some of the items that you can find in a typical issue. Importantly, you can go to the website that's indicated at the bottom of the slide, or you can go to apa.org, then to Division 52, and download past issues of the bulletin. And that's especially useful also to persons living in the not so wealthy countries because it's all free of charge. And they can inform themselves that way about what's going on in the international world of psychology. A few years ago, in 2011, the division began to publish a new journal, namely International Perspectives in Psychology, Research Practice and Consultation. It's a quarterly journal. It's actually published by the Educational Publishing Foundation of APA. And you can find more information if you go to the two websites listed below. The first editor of the journal was Judith Gibbons, who lives both in the United States but also in Guatemala, and has been closely connected to the Latin American world of psychology that way. The new incoming editor is Stuart Carr, who is in Maori, we say Aotearoa, or alternatively New Zealand. And Stuart Carr is especially interested in indigenization of psychology in both in New Zealand but other parts of the world, but also in linked issues such as poverty, the role of psychology in the Pacific region, and so on. And he's now the editor who is examining new articles that are being submitted to the journal. As befits the title of the journal, articles in it are expected to address global issues, international issues from a psychological perspective. And therefore, you can find many articles that publish research focused on human behavior, human experiences in many parts of the globe. It also has a certain applied flavor to it. And so there are discussions of intervention strategies, and if there's evidence of empirical nature about how successful these strategies might be, that will be certainly an article that is of great interest to the readers. There is considerable emphasis on context, which is sometimes left out in more standard journals, and cultural inclusivity. If you look at many of the articles that have so far been published, they often have a certain connection to mental health issues. But these are mental health issues spread around the world, and what's also very important, issues that may exist in low-income or medium-income countries, where, after all, the majority of the human population of this globe lives. And these are issues that are sometimes neglected to some degree in standard journals published in the richer countries in the Western world, both in North America and Europe. So that's certainly a goal for this journal. The third publication series that began really in earnest is only a good year old. It is the International Psychology Book Series. It is being published by Information Age Publishing. If you don't know this publisher, they are especially well known in the educational world. But they also published, for instance, a well-regarded series on cultural psychology, a series that overlaps to some degree with the concerns of international psychology. The three editors of the series, that's myself, Chanel Poirasley, and Harold Takushin. And we are interested in publishing volumes that look at psychological topics from global, international, cross-cultural, cultural, and multidisciplinary perspective. Well, the scope of the series is pretty broad, right? But there has to be an international, cross-cultural flavor to the book that would be likely to appear in this series. The books can be more of an applied nature, they can be more of a theoretical nature, they can also have a certain political set of implications, they can have the teaching of international psychology, and so the specific area is of less interest for the editors of the series than the international and global flavor that the manuscripts are expected to have. The first volume to appear in this series is entitled Pathfinders in International Psychology. And the editors are Grant Rich, who was also the previous editor of the International Psychology Bulletin, and myself. It's a little bit unusual because it, on the one hand, includes historical contribution, but on the other hand, it also contains chapters that discuss pioneers of international psychology that are now active in various parts of the world. So the volume begins with Franz Anton Mesmer. That's the person who mesmerized people a good 200 years ago, and who pioneered an intervention method that was widely practiced for about 50 to 60 years, but now, of course, has pretty much disappeared from view. And it ends with a chapter focusing on the present president of the International Union of Psychological Science, Seth Cooper, the union that is sort of like the United Nations within the realm of psychology. Seth Cooper is not only the first African president of the union, but he was also the president of the 2012 International Conference on Psychology in Cape Town, a place that he knows only too well because he spent a good 8 years in prison together with Mandela and other persons involved in the anti-apartheid movement. So in a way, he represents the new world. And I'm happy to say that he is helping to lead psychology into a somewhat different direction, a more international direction. Again, you will find information about websites that you can consult. It probably would be best for you to consult both of these websites. And the first website contains a sample book proposal. So if you're interested in possibly submitting a manuscript or at least a proposal to the series editors, you may wish to take a look at the proposal that tells you what the editors would like to know, which is not only what your book is about, but other things such as, for instance, are there any competing books? Who do you think are the likely readers of the book? Practical issues that a publisher has to concern himself or herself with, because a publisher is also a business enterprise and not just an academic enterprise. So I hope that if you consider publishing a book, you will keep this book series in mind, because I think it will be a truly interesting book series. If there's time, we can discuss some other international psychology journals and newsletters. I enlisted a bunch of them. Most of them published by well-known internationally or cross-culturally oriented psychology organizations. And but maybe what we can do now is, if you have any questions, please ask them. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gielen. I think it might be best if you type your question on the chat box. I hope you can see the chat box. I'd be more than happy to relay to Dr. Gielen. Dr. Gielen can also see the question that you post on the chat box. So we're opening it up for questions. Oh, we have a question, Uwe. Grant is asking, how can authors ensure collaborations are truly international rather than just regional?
So the question is, how can we ensure that we don't go back to the old systems of the we're focused pretty much in one part of the world, since most academic psychologists teach in the economically better off countries. That means often, always, North America, Europe, coming up in East Asia, and some other parts of Asia, and of course Latin America, certain regions of Latin America. I think it is generally not very difficult to find authors from different parts of the world that are interested in contributing to books or journal articles. If, for instance, you look at the leading journal of cross-cultural psychology, namely the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology, which is published by the International Association of Cross-Cultural Psychology, you'll find that, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, many articles appearing in that journal have numerous authors, often whole teams of 10 or 15 authors, because the focus of these articles is to have samples of different countries. So I would say one thing you can do is go to journals and, of course, books that publish articles and chapters from around the world, and think about, if you're a book editor or a journal editor, inviting some of them. And there are other journals. Let me mention one journal that American psychologists, at least, are not very likely to read, which always surprises me, namely the journal called European Psychologist, which is published by the European Federation of Psychology Associations. And in a way, the design of the journal is a little bit like American Psychologist. So the journal covers a broad range of topics. Most authors in the journal are European psychologists from many different countries. The Federation has, I believe, 36 or so member nations. And it's a pretty selective journal. Then, at least in the realm of social psychology, you could go to the Asian Journal of Social Psychology, which publishes obviously Asian articles with some focus on East Asia. It's a well-regarded journal. And if you're interested in authors from that part of the world, look at who is writing interesting articles, for instance, in the Asian Journal. And finally, there are several books that are being published about international psychology and where psychology in different parts of the world is going. Stevens and Redding published such a book that looks at psychology in 27 different nations located around the world. And so if you're interested in, let's say, psychology in Argentina, you want an Argentinian author, you go to one of those books. There's another one by Baker on the history of psychology, also in 27 different countries, just came out a few years ago. So I don't think it's very difficult to find authors who are active and who come from around the world and who are able to publish in English either because their English is good, or at least they have access to resources so that somebody at the institution goes over their chapter or their article and make sure that the publication is written in, or the manuscript is written in understandable English. Maybe some other questions?
Are there other questions? Well, I have a, okay, well, somebody has a question. So Judith is online.
Yeah.
Have you addressed open access journals and the controversies about predatory journals?
I have not addressed the controversy. My own policy is to ignore all those emails from journals that I don't know much about and that are open access. Predatory, I believe, in your question means is that such journals will publish almost anything, but they will charge you. Right? And it is the case that in quite a few countries, people are forced to publish in English language journals, and they may be willing to pay if that means they're keeping their academic job. As for myself, I think there are so many psychology journals, including quite a few international journals, that are not open access, simply that I simply don't pay too much attention to such journals. I don't know whether that's a good policy, but at least that's my policy. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Mercedes has a question about, are these points available to use to promote Division 52? Yeah, I guess I can answer that. Yes, I think these PowerPoints will be made available on the Division 52 website at some point. And it will be the maybe a PowerPoint, the actual PowerPoint presentations with the links in it. So yes, I hope I answered your question, Mercedes.
Yeah. I might add that it's up to Division 52, how long these PowerPoints. I was told we have a very concise PowerPoint, and I will ask whether I can add a few more slides, or whether the intention is to have very precise
guess I'm speculating that the answer to that is that may certainly update the PowerPoint, but given that it's being video recorded, the PowerPoint is part of the video recording, but we can put a link to an updated PowerPoint alongside the video recording that will be made available on the website. So it could be updated. It's just that the actual recording, you can't really update the PowerPoint on it.
So then there will be a few links to either other PowerPoints or other information ultimately.
Great. Dong has a question. Any topic for the next book in the book series? He's just curious.
Yeah. There are 3 books that are being book projects that are being looked at right now, but no decision has been made as yet, and they're quite different. One is much in an applied area, and a second one, a little bit surprising. There's a book out on Obama's first 20 or so years, which were spent mostly in Hawaii and Indonesia. It's a psychologically oriented book with a sort of Ericksonian perspective on identity and culture, and the author is considering revising the book and having it this time published in our series. And the third book, I'm not quite sure, has to do, these are projects that have not been decided on. They have to do with parent-child relations in different parts of the world from a certain theoretical point of view.
That's the book that he's proposing. He wants to know the next book in the series, the book that he will propose. We're looking for manuscripts.
We are always looking for manuscripts. So if the question is, would it make sense for me to consider submitting a book proposal? By all means, do so. Right? Let me repeat that the scope of the books that can appear in the series is quite broad, meaning we're not following any theoretical perspective, we're not focusing on any particular part of the world, and maybe most importantly, we're not focusing on a specific area of psychology. Right? As long as the scope of the book is international in nature, and that often also means there's a certain cross-cultural flavor to the book.
Judith has more of a comment, but I'm not sure, Ube, if you want to reply to it, but let me just read it really quickly. He said that some authors from the majority world are arguing that we should only publish in open access journals so that those who don't have access to traditional journals can read those findings. Do you have any comment?
Well, I mean, thank you for this comment. It obviously is addressed to one important problem around the world, namely that in many low-income and medium-income countries, people simply don't have the money to either buy journals or textbooks, nor do they necessarily have access to any libraries that contain good material. I certainly have spent some time in countries as varied as Pakistan, a couple African countries, Nepal, and so on. I have looked at some of these libraries, and there just isn't very much in them. And it's nobody's fault. There just isn't the money. Right? So I know that some policies now say maybe organizations like APA should, and actually sometimes do, allow certain libraries in low-income countries to gain access to some of their journals. And I'm all for it because inequality in economic resources is a huge global problem. If we can do anything to lessen a little bit the impact of such inequalities, that is certainly something very good to think about.
Okay, I guess, great. Well, I do have a question, Dr. Gielen, about perhaps helping our international colleagues help publish in journals that are primarily written in English. And I was wondering if there are certain incentives for psychologists in other countries, research psychologists, to be able to do so. I mean, is Division 52, for example, doing something like that?
Yes,
Judith, maybe.
yes. Let me point out that there are doctoral students, early career psychologists in Division 52 who have indicated that they're willing to go over manuscripts that are whose authors do not use English as a first language, and therefore they have problems in just saying exactly what they wish to say. And so if somebody submits a manuscript, for instance, a chapter in an edited book, as an example, that chapter can be given to an early career psychologist or doctoral student, and they will go over it. Right? Their contribution will be acknowledged. You know, the chapter will have somewhere a comment that says so and so was very helpful in improving, you know, the English language aspects of this article or chapter. So there are some resources available of that sort in Division 52. And again, I'm all for this because that's another way to reduce somewhat inequalities. Let me make a general comment about language because English is not my first language. German is. And then I learned French, so English is really my third language. I find that most American authors ignore publications in any language not in English. Juris Dragons, a very well-known counseling psychologist, in 2001 published an article on this topic in American Psychologist. And aptly, Juris speaks fluently 5 languages. I can testify that his German is excellent, and his Russian, from what I understand, is equally good. And so he practices what he preaches, and he says, look, that's a huge problem. Right? It is a problem. And I don't know exactly how to overcome it because it is unlikely that English-speaking psychologists suddenly decide to learn another language just so they can go to publications in that other language. The next question from Judy is, do I have experience publishing with Wikipedia? If you go to the article on Wikipedia called International Psychology, frankly speaking, I wrote it. And if you have any suggestions about how to improve that article, and if Wikipedia allows me to add stuff, by all means, send me an email. I might add that Wikipedia articles are, as we all know, uneven in quality. If you want to do something about this, go to the cross-cultural psychology article, because that needs some work. That's just my private little recommendation.
Are there any other questions? We have a good 20 minutes left, but if there are no other questions, we may have to end up ending sooner. But
No, I can make additional comments.
All right, great.
If there are no other questions, then let me just say a little bit about some other international psychology journals, not just Division 52 journals and newsletters, and something about how to get into these journals. I think we all know that journals are these days rated according to impact ratings, and that those impact ratings differ enormously, and that certain journals have very high rejection rates. For instance, in a recent article, I noticed that the editor of the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology indicated that 84% of all submissions are rejected. Not necessarily outright. In other words, somebody might submit a journal article, a manuscript, gets reports by referees, and then makes changes in his or her manuscript and then submits it somewhere else. That could happen. But there are many journals that have very high rejection rates. So what's the answer to this? One way to look at this is to say that any decent article dealing with psychological topics can probably be published somewhere. But then it is up to the authors to follow certain strategies. And that's even more important if one's first language is not English. That is important for any author. And here, just sort of, again, this is my private list of strategies. First of all, whenever I write something, I give whatever I write to somebody else to look at without fail. And I sometimes say to people, look, if God wrote something, it probably can be improved. So somebody always will have suggestions, and they can be either with respect to style. So I give my article to somebody whose English I admire. I'm lucky enough to have a couple colleagues who fit this description. Or with respect to the internal logic of the article. For instance, a common comment is, you know, you have 3 sections here. I don't know exactly how you got from section 1 to section 2. And maybe you can also have a little better connection between section 2 and 3. And of course, colleagues may also comment on the content of what you're writing about and remind you, you know, here's another viewpoint and here's an author who represents his viewpoint. Maybe you can shortly discuss this in your article. So that I think everybody should do. Then, very important, you have to read the mission statement of the journals. And any journal editor, and I've been the editor of 2 journals, knows that you sometimes get manuscripts that simply belong to some other journal, regardless of how good or not good these manuscripts are. It's simply they were sent to the wrong journal. The same holds true, incidentally, for edited books, where people sometimes don't really read the instructions or guidelines by the editors, but they write what they're used to writing, and it may be a very good chapter, but it may not fit into the edited book very well. So that's very important. And another the obvious comment is keep to the page specifications. It is common for a journal to say, we want so many thousands of words, or to a book editor, and then you get a manuscript that's twice as long. It's not up to the editor to suggest what should be cut from a manuscript initially. It's up to the writer to say, here is a manuscript, and I cut it down. And finally, to make one more comment, I find that when you have, let's say, a 30-page manuscript, and you cut it down by 5 to 10 pages, chances are your shortened manuscript will be better. Not just more concise, but better than the longer manuscript, because the shortening process forces you to think very precisely about what it is that you really want to say, what's most important, and to say it in just a few words. And so that's a general comment, but I see that there's a question by Harold. Yes.
Okay, so Harold wanted to find out, would you recommend that students and colleagues publish important articles in Wikipedia that are currently missing in this free global multilingual source?
APS is actually sponsoring a project, apparently a big project, to improve articles in Wikipedia. And the project is used, for instance, by some professors who say, okay, I'm teaching such and such a course. Here are 3 Wikipedia articles that I think could be done better. And the professor then works together with students to improve those 3 articles. That's A, good for everybody if the article really is improved. B, it's a very good practice for those students. And if I may say so, it is probably also a very good practice for the professor. Okay? So that's a project going on. And there is no reason why other people not being part of the project cannot do what this project intends to do on their own. And for instance, you could have a class, and you could make a class project out of this. And say at the end of this class, we will have written an article, especially if it's a sort of a survey article, that hopefully will be an improvement over the old article, or possibly will even be a new topic and a new article. I hope this answers your question.
Is what you wrote exactly what appears on the Wikipedia entry?
Pretty much, yes. Right. I might say that Wikipedia, for instance, doesn't always follow APA guidelines for references, so they sometimes have their own style. Personally, I don't think that's a very important issue. But I remember that initially They published the article together with a comment, which I've seen over other articles, which basically says, A, this article is not really following Wikipedia style. Wikipedia style is not necessarily the style that you're used to and taught in graduate school or by journal editors. For instance, we're taught that if you write a survey article, you should cite original research literature. That's your job, right? Sort of like an article that appears in the psychological bulletin, right, where people might spend years collecting all the research literature pertinent to a given question. However, Wikipedia says you should cite authorities, especially sort of like encyclopedias, overall summaries of a given topic, and so on and so on, which is really different from the advice that I mentioned before. So in that sense, Wikipedia articles follow a different rationale. Whether it's appropriate or not, I leave open to anybody who's listening to these comments. Okay.
Are there other questions from our audience?
Yeah. If you have a question, ask it. Otherwise, I will say a few more things about the list of journals that's on the slide in front of you. Right? It contains a list that would probably be not that different if it were to be made up by somebody else. So we have 2 journals by IAAP. Incidentally, the oldest international organization for individual members that's truly international in nature was founded in 1920. And that has been active over many years. Then it has a couple journals that are more regional, namely the Asian Journal of Social Psychology and the Revista Interamericana de Psicología, because these are 2 important regions, and I hope that people outside the region will take a look at these journals. The European Psychologist is also more or less regional in nature. Then we have a couple cross-culturally oriented journals, the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology and Cross-Cultural Research, which is a journal sponsored by the Society for Cross-Cultural Research, a small research-oriented organization that includes quite a few anthropologists. So you will find in that journal also articles that are oriented towards a more anthropological approach, especially the approach that is both empirical in nature, so it's not a postmodern journal, let's say, and compares cultures in different parts of the world. Right? Anthropologists are also more likely to discuss small-scale societies, whereas the Journal of Cross-Cultural Psychology, for instance, often includes national samples. Then we have the International Journal of Psychology, that's the International Union of Psychological Science, again, a major journal with a broad impact. And then we also have a couple newsletters, one by ICP, that's the International Council of Psychologists, and Psychology International, which is published by APA's international office. So the international office is different from the Division 52. Certainly, it's presently headed by Dr. Mary Bullock, but pretty soon that will be a new person. And that newsletter is widely read, not just in the United States, but in other parts of the world. And let me finally add that, of course, organizations such as IAP also have newsletters, but it's easy to access those by going to the website of the organization. To this, we might add numerous journals of a more or less international nature that focus on a specific area within psychology. There are more than 100 specialized international psychology organizations. And of course, there's no way to list some of these journals. If you're focusing on a specific area, you're probably familiar with a given journal anyway.
So I could read it. Would you like me to read it, Jose?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So thanks for the suggestions on matching your manuscript to the journal mission. Gary Vandenbos, formerly of APA, made an additional suggestion about having someone read your manuscript. He suggests that you have two readers, one an expert in the field and the other not.
Entirely, I practice that strategy. For instance, in my college, there's a gentleman in the college relations office who writes day in, day out, and he sometimes reads my shorter manuscripts. I can't give him a longer manuscript, that's not fair. And he's certainly not a psychologist. And he not only, quote, fixes my English, but he also tells me if he feels I should add something. And finally, he does something else. Because he writes for the general public, he tells me whether my stuff is too boring and whether I should add something that catches the interest of the reader, but is pertinent to, of course, the topic. So, yes, Gary Vandenbos, who has enormous experience in publishing, certainly knows how to give good advice.
I see that we have about a minute and a half left, so perhaps might be best to end here. This is probably going to be up on the website. I'm hoping that perhaps in the next couple of weeks or so, we'll send out an announcement that part of the website is the International Leadership Network page. So it will be in that site, but maybe what we can do is send out an announcement at some point when it's ready so that you could view the session again. And if you have any further questions or comments, maybe you can direct it directly to Dr. Gielen. We will provide his email on the website, but if you don't know his email, you can go to the website and contact either me, Dr. Jean Chin, any one of the officers who will probably know. I think Dr. Gielen's email is on the website as well. In one of the, I think are you chairing a committee or any?
Yes, I'm still chair of the publications committee, so my email should be at the very end of the International Psychology Bulletin, where all the officers and so on are listed.
And besides, Dr. Gielen's pretty easy to find if you just Google his name. So you'll probably find the St. Francis College website.
Yeah, you go to St. Francis College, go to the International Cross-Cultural Psychology. I'm involved. That was listed by email.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gielen. I thank you to all the people who had participated in this session. And hopefully you have a good night. Thanks again.
Thank you so much for your patience. Appreciate being given the opportunity to say something about publication.
Thank you.